Welcome to your personalized deep dive.
Oh, cool.
Today we're going to Zimbabwe.
Sounds fun.
We're going to dive into the world of community land rights.
Oh, very cool.
Our guide for this is going to be a document
Okay.
from the Community Alliance for Human Settlements in Zimbabwe,
Got it.
CAHSC.
Catchy.
It's full of strategies to help communities hold on to their land.
Yeah. That's especially important these days, right?
Yeah,
Because land in Zimbabwe is facing pressure from every side.
absolutely.
Mining companies searching for valuable resources.
Right.
Agriculture is expanding. The population keeps growing.
Right.
A recipe for conflict.
Totally. And,
Yeah.
in Zimbabwe, land isn't just about economics, right?
No.
It's connected to people's homes, their livelihoods, their cultural heritage.
Definitely.
Imagine living on land your family has farmed for generations,
Oh,
and you're told you have to leave
just like that.
in a matter of weeks.
Weeks. Wow, that's awesome.
Sadly, that's the reality for many communities in Zimbabwe.
Heartbreaking situation.
Absolutely.
And it's made even more complex by
Right.
this unique system of communal land.
Communal land.
Yeah,
Okay, help me understand this.
sure.
The name suggests it should be protecting communities.
Well, it should be,
Right.
but is it that simple?
I feel like there's a but coming.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
The concept is rooted in protecting communities.
Okay.
It's enshrined in Zimbabwe's constitution.
Okay.
It's meant to be administered by traditional leaders,
Uh-huh.
following customary law.
Okay.
It's a way of recognizing those connections between communities and their land,
Right.
long-standing connections.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
And maybe a little frustrating.
Oh.
You see, while the Constitution protects this land,
Right.
there's also the Communal Land Act,
Okay.
which gives a lot of power to the president and government ministers to make decisions about it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound good.
No, sometimes that clashes with the authority of those traditional leaders
Yeah.
and the communities themselves.
Right. So even though the Constitution is meant to protect these communities,
It should be.
there are loopholes that leave them vulnerable.
Unfortunately, yes. And here's a prime example.
Okay.
While the Constitution prevents the government from permanently taking communal land,
Right.
the president can change its classification to state land.
Oh,
Yeah. And this opens it up for other uses.
so they can just kick those people off.
Yeah, basically. And that's exactly what happens sometimes.
Wow. So the laws meant to protect people can sometimes have unintended consequences.
You got it.
It sounds like this legal complexity is making forced evictions a growing problem.
Exactly. And many of these evictions are happening without something called free, prior, and informed consent.
Okay.
FPIC for short.
Got it.
Okay, it's an internationally recognized right,
Okay.
especially important for indigenous people,
Uh-huh.
stating that communities must consent to development on their land. And that consent has to be freely given
Right.
based on understanding the impacts.
Mhm.
And most importantly, it has to happen before anything starts, not after.
Wow. So how can these things even happen if there are laws and international standards in place?
That's a great question, and the guide gives a stark example.
Okay.
The case of Batoka,
Bertoka.
villagers there were given a mere 4 months
4 months.
to leave their homes,
Gee.
to make way for a new township.
Wow.
No alternative land, no real consultation, no FPIC.
That's just not right. These communities deserve to benefit from any resources extracted from their land,
Yeah,
and they certainly deserve a voice in how their land is used.
100%.
It feels like we're talking about more than just legal technicalities. We're talking about people's entire lives being uprooted.
Exactly. And within this already challenging context,
Yeah.
there's another layer we can't ignore.
Okay.
The impact this has on women.
Our listener is particularly interested in this aspect, so let's dive into that a bit more. How does this play out?
So in Zimbabwean society,
Yeah.
customary practices often favor men when it comes to land ownership
Okay.
and inheritance.
Right.
This leaves women in a precarious position, especially if they're divorced or widowed.
Right. They could lose everything.
Exactly. Their homes, their livelihoods, everything.
Wow. And the guide points out that this creates a real tension, right?
Absolutely.
Because even though Zimbabwe's constitution guarantees equal land rights for women and men,
Right.
those customary practices often contradict this.
A perfect example of the difference between what's written in law and what happens in reality.
Right. So it's not enough to change laws.
Mm,
You have to address the underlying cultural norms
absolutely.
and power structures that are disadvantaging women.
You got it. Yeah, it really underscores that land rights are about so much more than legal documents,
Right, yeah.
about people's lives, their hopes, their futures. And this guide does a fantastic job of bringing those human stories to the forefront. One area where this is especially clear is the impact of mining.
Mining, yeah, we often hear about mining bringing in revenue for countries.
Right.
What about the costs?
Yeah, that's the big question.
What does the guide say about how mining activities on communal land impact the people who live there?
It's definitely a point of tension, and the guide reveals a stark reality.
Oh,
You see, the Mines and Minerals Act actually considers communal land as non-state land.
okay.
And what's shocking is that this classification means a mining company can begin operations with little more than a simple notification to the rural district council.
Hold on, so you're telling me
Yeah.
that you're living on land that has sustained your community for generations,
Yeah,
and suddenly a mining company can just set up shop
pretty much.
with barely any consultation,
Right.
let alone consent.
Yeah, it's a problem.
I don't understand how that's even legal.
Yeah, it's definitely controversial.
What about the traditional leaders, the residents?
Yeah, you'd think they would have a say,
Right.
but that's the troubling part.
Yeah. The guide is very clear that these leaders and residents are often completely excluded from the process.
Wow. So they have no power.
Very little in these situations.
So the law is basically prioritizing the interests of these companies
It seems that way.
over the rights of the communities who live on the land.
Yeah, it paints a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, it does, and it gets worse.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
The guide explains that those holding mining claims on communal land can mine,
Mm-hmm.
use water, cut down trees, build structures,
Right.
all with very little obligation to compensate residents.
No way.
The only exception is if their activities directly impact cultivated land.
That's just not right. These communities deserve to benefit from any resources extracted from their land.
I agree.
And they certainly deserve a voice in how their land is used.
Absolutely.
It feels like there's a real disconnect
Mhm.
between national laws and international standards like FPIC that we talked about earlier.
You're right that disconnect is one of the key issues the guide highlights.
What's fascinating is that it reveals a discrepancy between the Communal Land Act itself and the Constitution.
Okay.
The act gives the president the power to unilaterally change the status of communal land to state land.
Right, which we talked about.
Yeah.
It makes it easier for companies to come in and use it for things like mining.
Exactly.
So the very law that's meant to protect communal land
Yeah.
can be used to undermine it.
It's a contradiction for sure.
That seems incredibly contradictory.
It is, and it creates a great deal of uncertainty for those communities.
Right. Recommend.
And this misalignment between legislation and the Constitution comes up again
Okay.
when we look at something called the Rural District Councils Act.
Okay, now I'll admit, all this legal terminology is a little overwhelming for me.
It's a lot to take in.
What exactly does the Rural District Councils Act have to do with community land rights?
Well, essentially, this act gives rural district councils the power to acquire land for various purposes,
Mhm.
even if it means displacing those communities.
Oh.
And the guide explains that far too often this happens without proper consultation or
Mhm.
fair compensation for those forced to relocate.
So you have all these different layers of legislation,
Right.
and the way they interact can actually make communities more vulnerable to exploitation.
Unfortunately, that's often the case.
It seems like a very complex and daunting situation.
It is.
Are there any success stories?
Well, there are some.
Are there cases where communities have effectively pushed back against these forces?
This is where the guide shifts from problems to solutions.
Okay, good.
And it's truly inspiring.
Okay.
One of the key strategies it emphasizes is the development of something called model bylaws,
Model bylaw.
rooted in the Constitution and international standards.
Okay.
These bylaws empower communities to create their own rules for governing their land.
So it's about communities taking back control
Exactly.
and creating a more transparent system.
That's the goal.
Okay, give me an example of how this works in practice.
Okay, let's say a mining company wants to operate on communal land. Okay.
Model bylaws could clearly define things like who has the right to grant permission,
Uh-huh.
what the process for obtaining that permission looks like,
Right.
and how much compensation the community should receive.
It's about creating a more level playing field
Right.
where communities have the tools to negotiate and protect their interests.
Exactly.
It sounds promising, but it also seems like a monumental task.
It's a big challenge, for sure.
How realistic is it for these communities to actually make meaningful change when they're up against such powerful forces?
It's a David and Goliath situation, for sure,
Right.
but not impossible.
Okay.
The guide offers a lot of encouragement
Yeah.
and points to several institutions and mechanisms that communities can leverage for support.
Okay, like what?
For instance, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission
Okay.
and the Zimbabwe Gender Commission can be powerful allies.
What role do these organizations play?
Well, they're specifically designed to protect human rights,
Okay.
including the right to land.
Right.
They can investigate violations.
Receive complaints.
Okay.
And recommend solutions for redress.
So they're like watchdogs.
Yeah, in a sense, and just as importantly,
Yeah.
they raise awareness about human rights
Yeah.
and hold those in power accountable.
So communities aren't alone in this fight.
No, they're not.
There are established frameworks and institutions they can turn to for help.
Exactly.
What other support systems does the guide recommend?
It strongly encourages communities to connect with legal and human rights organizations that can provide direct assistance and support.
Okay, so like...
Groups like Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights,
Okay.
the Zimbabwe NGO Forum,
Right.
Women in Law in Southern Africa.
Okay.
These are just a few examples.
Right.
They have the expertise to fight for communities' rights.
It's encouraging to see this web of support,
Right.
both at the local and national levels.
Yeah, for sure.
It suggests that even when facing powerful interests,
Yeah.
there are avenues for justice and accountability.
Absolutely.
So we've explored the complexities of Zimbabwe's land laws and the challenges communities face.
Right.
We've seen some glimmers of hope in those national and international support systems.
Definitely.
But what about action at the grassroots level?
Right.
What can communities actually do to protect their land?
That's where this guide really shines.
Okay.
It goes beyond describing the problems and offers a blueprint for change.
I like it.
Remember those model bylaws we discussed?
Yeah.
The guide provides a step-by-step workshop agenda for communities to create them.
So it's like a toolkit for empowerment.
Exactly.
What are some of the key steps?
Well, it all starts with understanding.
Okay.
The guide emphasizes beginning the workshop by clearly stating its purpose, setting expectations and encouraging open communication.
Right.
It even suggests inviting local authorities to foster collaboration from the outset.
So it's about building a foundation of trust and shared purpose.
Exactly.
Before diving into the details.
Right from there, the agenda focuses on the heart of the matter. Understanding land and its significance.
I like it.
Imagine a room full of people sharing stories about what land means to them,
Yeah.
how they use it, why it's vital to their lives.
Right.
The guide encourages this kind of open dialogue,
Yeah.
bringing those personal connections to the forefront.
I bet those conversations get pretty passionate.
Oh, absolutely, especially in a context where land is so deeply intertwined with people's identities and livelihoods.
For sure.
The guide recognizes this
Yeah.
and prompts facilitators to delve into the different types of land rights
Okay.
and tenure systems that exist in Zimbabwe.
Remind me, we've talked about communal land,
Right.
but what other systems are there?
So Zimbabwe has a mix of systems.
Okay.
There's freehold tenure, where individuals or institutions actually own the land. They have title deeds.
Okay.
Then there's state land, which is owned by the government
Right.
for things like national parks.
Makes sense.
You also have leasehold and permit tenure, each with its own set of rules.
Sounds complicated.
It can be.
How does the guide help communities make sense of all this?
It encourages them to really understand the legal and customary frameworks
Okay.
that govern each system.
Okay.
This involves looking at specific laws,
Right.
like the Communal Lands Act,
Right.
the Land Acquisition Act,
Right.
the Mines and Minerals Act, even the Traditional Leaders Act.
That's a lot.
It is.
How can communities who may not have legal expertise even begin to grasp all of that?
Well, that's where the facilitator plays a vital role.
Okay.
The guide provides clear notes and explanations for each law,
Okay.
highlighting the key parts and how they affect communities.
Right.
It even suggests inviting local officials to explain those complex bylaws
Right.
in simpler terms.
So it's like building a bridge between the legal world and the everyday lives of the people these laws impact most.
Exactly.
And speaking of bridging the gap,
Yeah,
we talked earlier about the challenges women face when it comes to land rights.
right. A crucial issue.
How does the workshop address this?
It encourages participants to look critically at beliefs, policies, and practices
Okay.
that affect women's ownership and control of land.
Okay.
This means discussing traditional norms,
Yeah.
highlighting inequalities,
Correct.
and brainstorming solutions to empower women.
These conversations can be quite challenging.
They can be, but the guide emphasizes that the goal isn't to blame or shame.
Right.
It's about creating a safe space for dialogue, leading to practical solutions.
It's about ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table
Exactly.
and a voice in shaping their community's future.
Right.
But knowledge and discussion are only part of the equation, right?
True.
At some point, you need to move to action.
Absolutely.
What does the guide recommend?
Well, this is where the workshop transitions from analysis to action planning.
Okay, I like it.
Communities are guided to develop advocacy plans, outlining specific activities,
Okay.
assigning responsibilities,
Right.
and establishing ways to track their progress.
So they have a roadmap.
Exactly, and they also learn to identify key stakeholders.
By stakeholders, you mean?
Anyone who can influence decisions about land,
Correct.
government officials, traditional leaders, NGOs, human rights advocates.
So it's about understanding the political landscape
Exactly.
and strategically building a network to amplify community voices,
You got it.
to support those efforts.
Yeah,
The guide provides a resource list,
it does.
contact information for relevant organizations,
Yeah.
legal experts, government institutions.
All the essential contacts.
So it's like handing communities a toolbox
Exactly.
filled with everything they need to navigate this complex journey.
A roadmap to a better future.
This entire guide is such a remarkable resource.
It is.
It's empowering to see this kind of practical, action-oriented approach.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that even when facing enormous obstacles,
Yeah.
knowledge organization and collective action can pave the way to a more just and equitable future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into community land rights in Zimbabwe.
It's been a journey.
We've covered history, legal frameworks challenges, and most importantly,
Right.
the inspiring solutions emerging from communities themselves.
The power of collective action.
I hope this deep dive has given you a deeper understanding of this complex issue
Me too.
and a renewed sense of hope that positive change is possible.
It is possible.
This is just the beginning of your journey.
There's so much more to learn.
So here's a thought to carry with you.
Okay.
What role can you play in your own community in advocating for just and equitable land rights for all?
It's a question worth pondering.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep learning
Keep questioning.
and keep striving for a better world.
Thanks for joining us for